Working as a nurse can be exhausting, but there's something about working the night shift in an old, nearly empty psychiatric hospital that adds another layer, a much darker one. This story was shared with me by a nurse I'll call Sarah. She had been working for almost a year when these events took place. Sarah's hospital was a massive, old facility built decades ago, known for its long history of mental health care. It had been partially closed off, with entire wings no longer in use due to renovations that never seemed to get finished. The East Wing was one of these areas, a place no patients or staff were ever assigned. Over time, rumors grew about strange occurrences there. Whispers of shadows moving on their own, footsteps in empty hallways, and distant, disembodied voices. Sarah didn't pay much attention to the stories. She chalked them up to boredom, the kind of tales that circulate when people work long, lonely hours. But one night she found herself assigned to cover the graveyard shift. It started quietly enough. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint beeping of heart monitors, and the sound of her own footsteps on the polished floors were her only company. The East Wing's entrance was visible from her station. Even though it was supposed to be sealed, the sight of it always gave her an uneasy feeling. Around 2 a.m., she noticed something strange on the security monitors. There were 6 cameras in the hospital, and one of them faced the East Wing corridor. Normally, it showed nothing but empty halls. But tonight, she saw something. A figure. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, a dark silhouette with no discernible features. At first, she thought it was a glitch or a trick of the shadows. She leaned in closer to the monitor, her heart starting to race. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. She blinked. The screen flickered. When it stabilized, the figure was gone. Sarah checked the other monitors. Nothing out of the ordinary. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks. She made a mental note to report a possible camera malfunction. An hour passed. The hospital grew quieter, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then came the sound of footsteps. They echoed softly from somewhere down the hall. Slow, deliberate. She strained to listen, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from, but the sound seemed to drift, as if it were everywhere and nowhere at once. She grabbed her flashlight and stood up, heart pounding. The East Wing doors loomed in front of her, heavy and ominous. No one was supposed to be back there. She took a deep breath, telling herself it was probably maintenance or a janitor. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. She felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't a superstitious person, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. When she sat back down, her eyes flicked to the security monitor again. The camera for the East Wing flickered, and there it was. The figure had returned. This time, it was closer to the camera, standing just a few feet away from the lens. It wore what looked like a hospital gown. Its face was obscured, just a dark, hollow void where features should be. The longer she stared, the more her heart raced. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. Then it tilted its head. Sarah gasped and looked away. When she looked back at the monitor, the screen went black. Her hands trembled as she tried to switch the cameras. The other feeds were fine, empty hallways, empty rooms. But the East Wing camera refused to come back online. By the time her shift ended, she was shaken, but determined to find a rational explanation. The next day, she reported the incident to her supervisor, but they dismissed it as a glitch. She wanted to believe them, but the following night, it got worse. The whispers started around 3 a.m. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmuring, almost like the sound of wind through a crack in a window. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder. It was the sound of a man's voice, low and desperate. "Help me, please." She froze. Her pulse quickened. She turned her head slowly toward the East Wing doors. They were still locked, still closed. The voice came again. "They hurt me, don't let them." She gripped her flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew the doors were sealed. She had checked them herself. But the voice, it sounded so real. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, she approached the doors. Her hand hovered over the handle. The whispers continued, and with them came a distinct, icy draft. Her breath misted in front of her face. She peered through the small window set into the door. Nothing. Then, a flash of movement. Pale face, sunken eyes, a mouth twisted in agony. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The lights flickered violently. The sound of footsteps, racing, pounding footsteps, echoed from behind the door. And then, silence. She ran back to her station, trembling. Her eyes darted to the security monitors. All the feeds were clear, except one. The East Wing camera had come back online. The figure was there again. This time it was closer, and it was staring directly at the camera. Desperate for answers, Sarah started digging into the hospital's past. She learned about a patient who had died in the East Wing decades ago, a young man with severe mental illness. The records were vague, but rumors suggested he had been mistreated. Some said he was left alone for hours in restraints, his pleas for help ignored until it was too late. The more she read, the more the pieces fell into place. The figure, the whispers, the shadows, they all pointed to him. One final shift sealed her decision to quit. It was her last night. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. The air itself seemed colder. The whispers began again, louder this time. The footsteps followed. And then, the door to the East Wing slowly creaked open. She didn't open it. She didn't even touch it. The figure stepped out, pale skin, hollow eyes, a hospital gown soaked with dark stains. "You let them hurt me," it rasped. "You didn't stop them." Sarah couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place as the figure loomed closer. Its breath was cold against her skin. Tears streamed down her face as she prayed, her lips moving silently. The lights flickered one final time. The figure vanished. When she checked the security footage later, she saw herself standing at the door, and behind her, a dark, hollow figure, reaching out. She never worked the night shift again. And the East Wing? It was sealed for good. Hospitals are places where people go for healing, but at night when the hallways are empty, they can become unnervingly quiet. The perfect setting for shadows to stretch longer than they should, and for silence to carry a weight heavier than expected. This story was told to me by Tom, a night security guard at a hospital with a chilling experience he says he will never forget. Tom was new to the job, working night shifts to cover his bills. The hospital was a sprawling structure with long, sterile hallways and a basement that seemed endless. He liked the quiet. It gave him time to think. But early on, some of the older staff had given him a strange piece of advice. They warned him about a particular elevator at the far end of the basement, one that led to storage rooms and old maintenance areas. "Don't use that one after midnight," a veteran guard named Frank had said. "Just don't." Tom had laughed it off at first. It was the kind of superstitious nonsense you hear in old buildings. But every time he walked past that elevator, it gave him a strange feeling. The air around it always seemed colder, and there was a faint metallic smell like rust. Despite being rarely used, its buttons were worn, and he sometimes noticed smudges on the doors as if hands had pressed against them recently. One particularly quiet night, curiosity got the better of him. Midnight came and went, and his rounds brought him back to the basement. He stood in front of the elevator, staring at its dull, gray doors. The hospital was silent, except for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional creak of old pipes. He pressed the button. The elevator opened with a soft chime. Inside, it looked ordinary, a little dusty, but nothing out of the ordinary. He stepped in and pressed the button for the basement level. The elevator shuddered slightly as it began its descent, but instead of stopping at the basement, it kept going. Tom frowned. The panel had no buttons for floors below the basement. He pressed the open door button, but nothing happened. The elevator continued its descent, the floor numbers blinking out one by one until the panel went dark. Finally, with a heavy jolt, it stopped. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway that shouldn't have been there. Dim, flickering lights cast long shadows across cracked tile floors. The air was damp, carrying a smell of mildew and something far more unpleasant. Something rotten. Tom hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay inside the elevator, but his feet moved before he could think, stepping into the hallway. The elevator doors closed behind him with a hollow thud. He turned back, but there were no buttons, no way to call it back. Panic bubbled in his chest, but he swallowed it down. "It's just an old maintenance floor," he muttered, "nothing weird." As he walked forward, the sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were whispering them back. The corridor stretched far longer than seemed possible. Old gurneys and rusted equipment lined the walls. Then he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the hallway, her back to him. She wore a hospital gown, its pale fabric stained with dark, rust-colored blotches. Her long, black hair hung in tangled strands down her back. "Ma'am?" Tom called out, his voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned her head, just her head, to look at him. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Tom took a step back. Every hair on his body stood on end. "I'll call someone," he stammered. "I'll get help." The woman raised one hand and pointed down the hall. "He's down there," she whispered. "My son, I need to find him." Tom's throat tightened. There was something horribly wrong about the way she moved, as if her joints didn't bend the right way. But the desperation in her voice stirred a reluctant sense of duty. Against every instinct, he started walking in the direction she had pointed. As he moved, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. He passed doors with small, narrow windows, each revealing dark rooms filled with decaying hospital beds. He could hear the faint sound of a child crying, a soft, pitiful wail that made his stomach twist. He reached a door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, heavily rusted with deep gouges in the metal. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. "Don't open it," a voice whispered behind him. He spun around. The woman was gone. The hallway was empty. The child's crying grew louder. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He yanked the door open. Inside was darkness, pure, impenetrable darkness. The crying stopped. Something moved. A hand, skeletal and gnarled, reached out from the shadows. Fingers curled, scraping against the floor. Tom stumbled back, slamming the door shut. He turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway twisted around him, the lights flickering wildly. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, colder. He could hear footsteps behind him, heavy, dragging footsteps. The elevator loomed ahead, its doors miraculously open. He dove inside, slamming his hand against the buttons. The elevator groaned to life, ascending with a painful grinding noise. As it rose, he felt a presence just behind him, breathing down his neck. The lights flickered out. When they came back on, he was alone. The elevator dinged. The doors opened to the basement, exactly where he had started. Tom staggered out, his legs shaking. He looked back at the elevator. The floor indicator blinked, showing numbers that didn't exist. He quit the next day. Other guards took over his shift, but the elevator remained. Occasionally, they noticed it moving on its own, the floor numbers lighting up late at night, and sometimes, just after midnight, faint whispers could be heard from behind its doors. Whispers of a woman looking for her child. It was a stormy night, the kind where thunder growls like some great beast in the heavens and rain lashes the windows with relentless fury. Inside the old hospital, shadows stretched unnervingly down its long, sterile hallways. Dr. Thomas, a seasoned physician nearing the end of a grueling double shift, fought back exhaustion as he reviewed patient charts by the dim light of the nurses' station. Outside, wind howled, rattling the window panes while thunder shook the very walls. The storm's ferocity only heightened the eerie stillness within the hospital, broken only by the hum of machinery and the soft squeak of rubber soles on polished floors. At precisely midnight, the phone rang. The shrill, sudden sound made Dr. Thomas jump. He snatched it up, already weary. "Dr. Thomas here," he muttered. "Doctor," a voice whispered. Young, trembling, it was Nurse Roberts, one of the newest hires. "There's a patient in room 406. They're critical. You need to come immediately." Dr. Thomas frowned. "Room 406? That can't be right. That room—" He trailed off, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest. Room 406 had been vacant for years, closed off, forgotten, a relic of the hospital's murky past. "Are you sure there's no patient listed in that room?" he pressed. "I'm certain," the nurse stammered. "Please hurry." The line went dead. Unease crept up Dr. Thomas's spine. He grabbed his stethoscope and made his way down the hall, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. The hospital seemed to breathe with its own life. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of unseen drafts, magnified in the suffocating silence. The hallway to room 406 was darker than he remembered. The overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on his tired eyes. As he approached the door, the temperature dropped, his breath fogged before him. The chart outside the door was bare. No name, no diagnosis, only the stark number 406. He knocked. Silence. The knob turned easily in his hand, and the door creaked open. The room was icy cold. Pale moonlight filtered through the rain-smeared window, casting a sickly glow over an empty hospital bed. The sheets were rumpled, as if someone had just been lying there. Dr. Thomas' pulse quickened. The stale, antiseptic air carried a faint undercurrent of something darker, a sour, rotting smell that made his stomach churn. He stepped further inside, his shoes scraping the tile floor. "Hello?" he called out softly. Lightning illuminated the room for a split second, and in that brief flash, he saw it. A figure on the bed, thin, frail, eyes wide with silent agony. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He staggered back, heart pounding. "No!" he whispered. His eyes darted around the room, searching for answers. The walls seemed to pulse with shadows. The sound of a distant, rattling breath filled his ears, not from him, not from the machines, from something else. Desperate for clarity, he fled to the nearest computer terminal. His fingers trembled as he accessed the patient records. Room 406, nothing. No admission, no record, no patient. He questioned Nurse Roberts, but she stared at him, bewildered. "I never called you," she said. "There hasn't been anyone in that room for years." Unease twisted into dread. Dr. Thomas couldn't shake the memory of that figure, nor the suffocating sense of despair that clung to the walls of room 406. Determined to uncover the truth, he descended into the hospital's archives, a labyrinth of forgotten files. Dust and time clung to the shelves as he searched. Hours passed before he found it, a thin, yellowed file labeled Jacob Reeves. Jacob Reeves had been admitted decades ago, a young man barely in his 20s suffering from pneumonia. He had been left in room 406, critical but neglected. The nurses were overworked, the doctors preoccupied. His pleas for help went unanswered. He died alone. The official report labeled it an unfortunate oversight, but whispers among the staff told another story. A tale of malpractice, of negligence so profound it had left a stain on the very soul of the hospital. And the final damning revelation? One of the attending doctors responsible for Jacob's care had been Dr. Thomas's own father. The weight of it crashed down on him. His father, revered and respected, had carried this dark secret to his grave, and now Jacob Reeves, or what remained of him, was seeking retribution. Compelled by a force he couldn't name, Dr. Thomas returned to room 406. The doors stood ajar, a dark invitation. The bed was no longer empty. A form lay beneath the thin sheet, unmoving. As he stepped closer, the sheet slipped away, revealing the hollow-eyed visage of Jacob Reeves. His lips moved soundlessly, his sunken eyes filled with endless sorrow and rage. "You failed me," a voice whispered, not aloud but inside Dr. Thomas' mind, reverberating with a torment that felt centuries old. "You'll feel better. You failed me, just like your father." Dr. Thomas's breath hitched. The air grew dense, oppressive, as Jacob's skeletal hand reached out, fingers curling in silent accusation. Panic seized him. He stumbled backward, slamming into the door. He clawed at the handle, the weight of unseen forces pressing against his chest, his breath shallow and rapid. The room seemed alive, the walls closing in, the shadows writhing. With a final surge of strength, he broke free. He fled down the corridor, his heart a wild drumbeat in his ears. When he glanced back, the door to room 406 was closed. The next morning he resigned. The hospital and its secrets would never let him forget, but he would not be part of it anymore. Room 406 remains sealed, a place where no one dares linger, and on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the rain beats against the windows, faint whispers can be heard from within. A cold draft slips through the cracks, carrying the echo of a restless soul still waiting, still searching for justice that may never come.